So I wanted to ask you if you could talk about your father, where he comes from, what his roots are, and what it was like for him growing up.
Okay. My dad's name was Ralph Ermatinger. He was born in North Dakota in a small town on August 11th, 1921. He is the middle of five boys. He grew up on a wheat farm in North Dakota, and my dad's heritage was his mom was white, Anglo. I guess they had been Quakers at some point, his mother's family. Her name was Susan Viola Keyes. And his dad was Native American, and his dad was from Wisconsin. His dad's name was William Ermatinger. And my grandpa Bill, I remember pretty well. We went to visit him a number of times when he was living in Wisconsin. My dad's mother died in the 1940s. My dad was pretty sure that it was a major heart attack. He thought she had always had heart problems her whole life, but had no evidence of it. She had a hard life because she was a farm wife and she was raising five boys during the Depression. She was a lifelong vegetarian, apparently. I never knew that. And my grandfather, of course, being Native American, he was a meat eater. On my dad's side, on his father's side, my grandfather, my grandpa Bill's side, their name was Ermatinger, which derives from a Swiss town called Ermatingen, which is on the shores of Lake Geneva in Switzerland. And the first Ermatinger came to the New World in the early part of the 1700s. He was trained as a gunsmith, and he came here. His name, I believe, was Lawrence Ermatinger. My father did a good deal of research on the genealogy of the Ermatingers, and then got so interested in it that he did a lot of research on his mom's side also. So the first Ermatinger here in the New World came to Montreal and worked as a gunsmith, but also worked as for a fur trading company called the Hudson's Bay Company. And he was involved with that. He had a number of descendants, and I don't know exactly, I can't remember everything about who was who and what was what. But the Ermatinger name is pretty well known, both in Sault Ste. Marie, Canada, because there was a fur trading post there, and there's a kind of a famous house called the Old Stone House that was built by, I don't know, he would have been probably my great uncle named Charles Oakes Ermatinger. And his nephew was named James Ruff Ermatinger. And James worked for the Hudson's Bay Company, but came down to Wisconsin and worked for, I believe, the American Fur Trading Company, but I'm not exactly positive. And he had a trading post, or a store, as they called it, where they would basically trade the Indians' furs for liquor and blankets, maybe, and a few things like that. But he ended up marrying a woman named Charlotte Cadott, who was the daughter of a very well-known fur trading guy named Michael Cadott, who, and Charlotte's mother was a woman named Equaziway. She was the daughter of White Crane, who was one of the big Ojibwe chiefs. Their origin was Madeline Island, which was actually named after Equaziway when she converted to Christianity. She became a Catholic. She changed her name to Madeline. And Madeline Island in the Apostle Islands on Lake Superior is named after her. And many of my ancestors are buried there, and that's my Indian ancestral home place. So Charlotte Cadott was the daughter of Madeline and Michael Cadott, and the granddaughter of a well-known chief named White Crane. And Charlotte had been married previously to somebody named Warren. She was a widow. She had 2 sons and a daughter, and one of her sons, James Warren, was a very well-known Native American. He wrote a history of the Ojibwe of Wisconsin and Minnesota that's still used as reference material today, even though it's well over 150 years old. And he was frequently sent to Washington, D.C. to negotiate and interpret for Ojibwe as they were making treaties with the United States. Charlotte married a second time to James Ermatinger, and it was him that had the fur trading post in what was originally called Vermilion Falls, and it later became Jim Falls, and it was named after Jim or James Ermatinger. My father told me that the trading post was actually on an island in the middle of the Chippewa River, but apparently that island's not there anymore because rivers change course over the years. And then it was in a building on the shore, on the eastern shore, I guess. Most of the town of Jim Falls is on the western shore. So when James married Charlotte Cadott, what happened was he had 6 kids. And the youngest, Frederick, was my great-grandfather. And Frederick, or Grandpa Fred, as my dad called him, they called the blue-eyed Indian because he had apparently inherited his father's blue eyes. But other than that, you had no idea he was Native American. I mean, you had no idea that he had any Anglo blood at all, because apparently he was very dark-skinned. But so there were 4 boys and 2 girls. I'm sorry, 4 boys. No, more than that. 5 sons and 1 daughter. The daughter Alice was sent to the Indian boarding school at La Pointe, Wisconsin, which is up by Lake Superior, to learn how to speak English and read and write and become educated. And she died of tuberculosis while she was there. And my great-great-grandfather, James Ermatinger, had already sent one of his other children, Elijah, who was, let's see, I think it was Elijah or Elisha. There was 2 different guys. One of them, who was younger than her, also up to the Indian school, and he apparently pulled his son out after Alice died, and none of the other kids were sent to that school. My great-grandfather Fred grew up not speaking any English at all. He could understand some words. He spoke Ojibwe and French, and that was it. And I don't know if he ever learned to read and write. I doubt it. He had 6 kids also, one of whom was my grandfather, William, also known as Grandpa Bill. They were all born on that where the trading post was on the east side of the river, the old family farm. I believe it's still in the family, but it was owned, if my memory is correct, by my dad's cousin Charlie, who was the son of one of James Ermatinger's other children. And I think it's still in the family, although I don't know for sure. I haven't been back to Wisconsin or met any of those cousins for many years. My dad had a number of first cousins around Jim Falls, and he was sent to Jim Falls in the summertime fairly often, and he liked it. When he got old enough, they stopped sending him because they needed him on the farm. Let's see. It took him many years to become a tribal member because his family had no residence on any reservation at any time. This was before reservations were, part of the deal for Native Americans. So it took him many years to get tribal enrollment, and he finally did in the 90s, and I became a tribal member also, as did my siblings. And so we're tribal members for what it's worth, but I definitely feel like an apple, red on the outside and white on the inside.
Yeah, well, that's a good summary of the history. So what was it like for your dad growing up in white America? How was he perceived? And I know he was in the military. Was he ever prejudiced against in his life? And were you as kids?
Well, my dad was definitely suffered a lot of prejudice. His in-laws were really unhappy about the fact that, not his in-laws, but, his in-laws too, but his grandparents were very upset about the fact that his mother married his father. They actually ended up having to elope because there was no approval or anything else like that. I guess finally my grandmother's parents relented and actually helped them buy a farm of their own. So there was that. My dad grew up in an area where there were a lot of Norwegian immigrants, and I think he and his siblings and my grandfather were probably the only Native Americans around that community. He never talked about any others at all. I know that he suffered a lot of physical abuse from the Norwegian kids. He's not got any kind of a liking for Norwegians. I guess because of that. He basically got the shit kicked out of him pretty often by, other boys because of that. I know he told me a few times that he and my Uncle Lem, his younger brother, who he was pretty tight with, would often team up to, fight him off. My dad was very, very smart. He graduated from high school a little bit earlier than a lot of people did. He was doing advanced mathematics in high school, which afforded him some opportunities when he was in World War II. He was right after he graduated from high school, he joined the Civilian Conservation Corps, which was going around the Midwest planting trees as windbreaks and things like that to help reclaim some of the farm areas that were created during the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. But he hated it because he didn't get his own paycheck. They sent the money to his parents, so he didn't get any of the money. And he was pretty upset about that. So he decided to leave the Civilian Conservation Corps, and he enlisted in the Army. And he enlisted fairly early. It was like the very beginning of 1941. It was before America was involved. And he had a lot of things happen in the Army. I guess the Army realized that he was a pretty smart guy, and they actually had him go to officers candidate school, OCS, and so he was commissioned as a lieutenant after he finished officer candidate school. He also was doing some kind of military intelligence work for a while. But then he heard he was going to get a posting that he was not wanting very much. I don't know what it was, but he actually volunteered for parachute school and decided that that might be the good way to go to escape going on this other posting. So he learned how to be a paratrooper. And he did actually have a bad landing and broke his leg at one point. And he recovered, and he kept being a paratrooper. And then his outfit was shipped out to the Pacific. And he said that they took him on a big boat, which is how they did it in those days, to the Pacific Theater, to New Guinea. And I think he said he was on the boat for like a week or something. He said everybody else was throwing up crazily because they were all seasick, and he happened to have the book Gone with the Wind with him. And he said he read the whole thing cover to cover, and he wasn't sick at all, and he thinks it was because he was so interested in the book. And so they went to New Guinea. They parachuted in, I guess, to the backcountry, which apparently New Guinea is very primitive in most places. And they were fighting the Japanese hand to hand, pretty much guerrilla stuff. And he did that for a while, and then, let's see, I guess his unit got pulled out, and I don't know where they went after that. I think he wrote it somewhere, but I haven't found the papers yet. I know they're around, saying what his military history was exactly. But he ended up being, he participated in the liberation of Leyte, so he is what's called an angel of Leyte. And what happened was the U.S. government realized that they had to liberate this horrible concentration camp on the island of Leyte that the Japanese were running, that things were really awful. People were starving to death, being tortured to death, and it was very brutal. So my dad's outfit parachuted in, and they liberated Leyte. In the process, my father won a Bronze Star. Mm-hmm. He never, ever talked about that. And he got a Purple Heart, and he said he claimed that was because he got shrapnel in his ass. I don't know if that was true. I don't remember him ever showing us any scars or anything. He also got a medal from the Philippine government for the liberation of Leyte. And he never talked about any of his medals other than the fact that we saw the Purple Heart one time and we asked him what it was for. He did occasionally talk about the bad stuff that happened during World War II. He said that there was cannibalism going on New Guinea, and the Japanese were cannibalizing the American soldiers and vice versa. And because they were on starvation rations. My dad said he took his belt in 6 notches on New Guinea. So it's pretty rough for him. He didn't have a good war. He suffered some abuse because he was Native American. His higher-ups often used him as a scout, and the excuse was that because he was an Indian, that would be the one thing he was good at. And that was despite the fact that he was an officer. And officers are not scouts. And so he did that frequently. And he wasn't happy about that either. He got busted down to second lieutenant at least once for fighting, I guess. I'm not exactly sure. He never talked about it. He had to do, of course, bad stuff because of the war. He said he didn't have a rifle very often, but because he was an officer, it was usually a big knife. He had a big knife, and he had 2 pistols with him. After the liberation of the Philippines, and after the atomic bombs were dropped, he was asked to be the commander of General MacArthur's honor guard, and to go to Tokyo and to guard General MacArthur during the surrender of Japan. And my father was there for the whole thing. He saw everything. He thought that General MacArthur walked on water. And he never, ever talked about any of that, about being in his honor guard. What a tremendous honor that was for him, I think. But he did talk about going around Japan, traveling a little bit. He climbed Mount Fuji. He said it was really exciting and really hard. And he had this wooden stick, which I remember vividly from my childhood, and it disappeared somewhere. But it was called a Fuji stick, and it was a hiking, like a walking stick, a staff. And as you go up Mount Fuji, there's tea houses and inns, and you stop, and they brand your walking stick with the mark of the tea house. So the whole thing had these, brands all the way up it with all these Japanese symbols and language and, I don't know Japanese, but we just thought it was the coolest thing. And he had that for most of my childhood, and I don't know what happened to it. Nobody in my family does. It was among the many things that disappeared. I suspect my stepmother threw it away because she was kind of mean that way. And it's too bad. At any rate, my dad came home from World War II, and he worked for a big landscape company that did projects in the Midwest for, I don't know how long, a few years. And then he met up with, or somehow got in touch with, somebody he was in the Army with, named Bob Ernest. And Bob came from either Minneapolis or St. Paul. And he got my dad to think about going to college on the GI Bill. And so my dad did. He enrolled in college there. He was living at Bob Ernest's mom's house, I guess in the apartment over the garage, while he was going to school at the University of Minnesota. And my dad, because he's an officer, and officers are subject to recall at the will of the U.S. government at any time, he got recalled for duty during the Korean War. So he had to go to Korea. And he was not happy about that. It was in the middle of when he was in school. And he wasn't happy because he disagreed with how the U.S. government was running the Korean War. As I said, he thought MacArthur walked on water, and MacArthur wanted to just go all the way to Moscow and get rid of all the communists and just get rid of that whole situation. And the U.S. government didn't. So my dad wasn't happy about the whole Korea experience. And he got discharged at the end of the Korean War, came home and went back to school and got a bachelor's degree in journalism from the J School at the University of Minnesota. And that's a pretty well-known journalism school, or at least it was. It was very well respected. And he started getting newspaper jobs doing editing in smaller towns in the Midwest. He worked in Racine, Wisconsin, and Osceola, and then he got hired for a job editing for the Idaho Daily Statesman in Boise, Idaho. So I moved there, and he was working there, and that's when he met my mom. And I guess the rest is history. But they eloped, but I don't know. I always had a feeling that my grandparents on my mom's side and her family were not happy about my mom marrying an Indian. There was a lot of, I don't know, weirdness about the whole thing. I think my Uncle Arby, my mom's twin brother, was okay with the whole thing, but I think other parts of the family were not. And I'm not sure that my grandparents were on board. I don't think they were happy. My mom was a society girl. She was in the junior league and she did all this, she was from one of the best families. Her father was a banker. He was a bank president. So, her marrying an Indian was not happy-making experience. At any rate, I was actually born in St. Paul, Minnesota, and so was my brother Paul. And then my parents moved to back to Boise when I think I was like 2.5, or maybe, I don't think I was 3 yet. And Paul was pretty little. And my sisters, Jane and Olie, were both born in Boise.
Did you experience any prejudice for your part of being Native American?
Yeah. When you grow up in pretty much white state with a bunch of white Mormons, and that's the majority of the people that lived in Idaho. 80% of the population of Idaho at that time was Mormon. There's quite a bit of prejudice. I've been called a blanket ass a couple of times. And, there was just, that we weren't equal. I really knew that I was not equal to my cousins who were white. And one of my aunts definitely rubbed that one in. It didn't feel very good. From her, the other cousins would get the preferential treatment, but it was just, whatever. But I do remember when I moved here to California, after I'd been here for about a month or so, my brother and I had this conversation about the fact that it was really nice to be somewhere where there were a lot of other brown-skinned people. And that felt good. And we didn't feel like anybody cared what color our skin was.